In the 1830s and 1840s in Great Britain, there were important political reforms that helped to quell political discontent and social discontent in that country. Today we'll talk specifically about the Corn Laws and the Reform Act of 1832. In the 1830s and 1840s, Great Britain's industrial middle class scored two significant political victories that solidified their growing economic and political power. The industrial middle class, of course, the owners of industry, the barons of industry, had risen in prominence really significantly by this time, and they, despite their wealth and influence, they remained pretty discontented because of the setup in Great Britain in Parliament especially. A lot of the new industrial cities like Manchester and Birmingham and Liverpool had grown so significantly over the previous century that they were not even represented in Parliament. Their population, despite the fact that their populations had grown and they were very significant to Great Britain's economy and to their national wealth, because of the way that Parliament was districted, I guess I would say, the way that representation was divided, these cities had literally no representation in Parliament, and therefore the industrialists who made their wealth in these cities had no representation in Parliament. And sometimes the industrialists, despite the fact that they were very wealthy, didn't have quite enough wealth to meet the property requirements in Parliament. So a great deal of their discontent stemmed from the fact that they were, and they understood this, driving the economic engine of the time, bringing a great amount of national wealth to the country, yet did not enjoy representation in Britain's Parliament. Something else that the middle class and the working class alike were discontented over significantly were a series of laws passed in the early 19th century called the Corn Laws. Now, before you fall asleep, the Corn Laws were really, really important. And as this cartoon alludes to, the blessing of peace on the curse of the Corn Bill, or the curse of the Corn Bill. The blessing of peace refers to the fall of Napoleon and the end of the Napoleonic Wars. You will recall, I hope, that Napoleon had tried to weaken Britain economically and to entice them into war through what he called his continental system, where he forbade or prohibited embargoed trade with Great Britain for the European continent. This allowed British domestic agriculture to flourish. And so when Napoleon fell and the agriculture and the continental system, of course, was ended, there was an influx of cheap grain and other agricultural products into England. And the British Parliament responded by passing the Corn Laws. And the Corn Laws were a series of very high tariffs on imported grains. And to give you a brief lesson in economics, a tariff is a tax on an import, and a tariff is meant to make imported goods more expensive so that people will choose to buy the domestic product. And so these laws favored British landowners who and their wheat production, and it made food, they had the net effect of making food more expensive, significantly more expensive. And so this is the blessing of peace on the curse of the Corn Bills. The Corn Laws were always controversial from the moment they came into existence, because the real beneficiaries of the Corn Laws were really the aristocracy and people who owned a lot of land and were really heavily engaged in agricultural production, benefited from this. It was passed by Parliament because this goes hand in hand with the political representation rural areas, large estates of the nobility, etc. But the way Parliament was divided, had divided or districted itself, which they call boroughs, their areas of representation. The way that they had set that all up heavily favored these large areas of land that were rural and predominantly agricultural. So this very much protected the Corn Laws very much protected the economic interests of the people whose political and economic interests were overrepresented in Parliament in the early 19th century. The working class hated the Corn Laws too. Remember, they are controversial from the start. By the early 19th century, by 1815, Great Britain was well into industrialization. Industrial cities had grown. The industrial working class had grown and was even in its second and third, potentially third generation. And they hated the Corn Laws because overnight the Corn Laws made food much more expensive. And you can see here on the little sign, the workers would demonstrate about this. There was discontent over the expensive food, as you can imagine, and bread, grain being the fundamental ingredient in bread, and bread being, of course, the fundamental part of a diet of the peasant classes and the working classes. The middle class was deeply offended by the Corn Laws as well. The Corn Laws really offended the industrial middle class's sense of liberalism and laissez-faire. Remember, our industrialists, our industrial middle class, they were the backbone of 19th century classical liberalism, economic freedom, laissez-faire, lack of restraint. So first of all, their sense of what is right, okay, their sense of liberalism was offended by these tariffs, which favored British agriculture, and they called for free trade, for economic liberty. So they had kind of that idealistic and ideological opposition to the Corn Laws. On a more practical level, they didn't want to have the pressure of paying their workers higher wages in order to offset the cost of the higher food. And they didn't want their working class to be discontented, to have them walking on eggshells, to be on the verge of violence and uprise. And so they were heavily opposed. The middle class was just as heavily opposed to the Corn Laws as the industrial classes were. During the 19th century, the British Parliament became fairly divided. It became pretty significantly divided, and we, as Americans, recognize the concept of a political party. Even in the 19th century, this was rather new in England, but Parliament became divided between parties, I guess we could call them, called the Tories and the Whigs. And the Tories, of course, were the more conservative group. The Tories represented the older agricultural interests. They represented the aristocracy and of course, many people beyond the aristocracy, but they would have been the allies of Metternich and good old-fashioned 19th century conservatism. And they were absolutely the dominant party through a great part of the 19th century, especially the first 50 years of it. Even though a group that grew in importance and significance during this time came to call themselves the Whigs. And the Whigs were more associated with 19th century liberalism, the idea of laissez-faire and restraint and personal rights, and they were deeply friendly to the Industrial Revolution and to the industrial middle class. Okay, so this is where this fight is. A man named Earl Grey, isn't that funny? Y'all like the tea? If you like tea, I like tea. Earl Grey, Earl is his title. His name is actually Charles, the Earl of Grey, became the Prime Minister of England in 1830, and he was a Whig, and he was a liberal, and he was friendly to industrialization, and he put his influence and weight behind generating political reform, because by 1830 there was pretty strong amount of discontent, of liberal discontent in England. And so the political reform that he became a champion of was not only something that he favored in his own ideas, but was really practical for the time to kind of tamp down this political discontent. This is all about the balance of power, who was going to have power in the political institutions of England. And you can see here, this is a rather pro-industrialist, pro-liberal cartoon. The little devil-looking creature down there in the front has reform attached to it, and he is pointing to the powers that be of the time period that favor the crown. You can see there the crown and the aristocracy, and you have other members of the Protestant religion and the gentry class and industrialization that are making up the other side, and they want to tip those balances. They were really quite confident, of course, in their significance and their importance to the country from an economic standpoint, and they demanded political representation commensurate to that. In 1832, Prime Minister Earl Grey got the Reform Bill, or the Reform Act of 1832, through Great Britain, and this is one of the most significant reform acts or political reforms in British history, and we could even say in world history, and it had many significant consequences. So here we have lots of symbols here in this tree, okay, but the tree, you will notice right here, represents the rotten borough system. Now, the way Parliament divided itself, the way representation was assigned in the British Parliament, was by a borough. What we would call that in the United States is a district. And the rotten boroughs referred to the idea that you would have these huge estates, these big landowners in England that were really rural and had very small populations, but would have lots and lots of representation in the British Parliament. And these big industrial cities that had grown up in the late 18th and early 19th century, Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool, and others, and parts of London even, that had none. Literally, they had nobody representing them in Parliament. So if you think about here in Tennessee, we have a state government in Nashville. And so what if in the state government in Nashville are very rural counties here, Haywood County, Morgan County, Claiborne County, etc. Very rural counties with lower populations had all the representatives, and you had no representatives elected from Knoxville or Memphis or Nashville. And you can kind of see this is how the industrialists felt, because a lot of their cities literally didn't have any representation. And so they're taking on this idea of the rotten boroughs. They call them rotten boroughs and want to get rid of those. And the Reform Act of 1832, as this cartoon shows and implies, got rid of the rotten boroughs. This is probably the most significant thing they did. They eliminated the rotten boroughs, and they redistributed representation in the Parliament to be more proportional. And what proportional means is it was more in keeping with the population distribution through the country, and so it gave not only some representation to the industrial cities, but significant representation to the industrial cities. And this is how political representation is distributed in the United States at the state level and the national level. Places with higher populations, states with higher populations, have more representation in the Congress or in your state legislature. So this is what the Reform Act does, most importantly, redistributes political representation by eliminating the rotten boroughs. It also, in doing this and in lowering property qualifications to vote and hold office, lowering those property qualifications, enfranchised essentially the entire industrial middle class. And so the Reform Act of 1832 gave the industrial middle class political power relative to, reflective of their growing and economic significance. It cooled off their discontent, it prevented any kinds of uprising at the time, and it, very importantly, elevated their political importance and prominence by giving them a lot of seats at the table. This, of course, as you might imagine, put pressure on the Corn Laws because the industrial middle class did not like the Corn Laws. And the controversy of the Corn Laws came to a head in the mid-1840s. Ever since the Corn Laws have been adopted, there was a formation of something called the Anti-Corn Law League to try to get these acts repealed. But in the mid-1840s, especially with the crisis of the potato famine in Ireland, the controversy over the Corn Laws really came to a head. And in general, worker discontent was really coming to a head. The middle class had simmered down a good bit because they got their political representation and everything what they were after, even though they were still appalled by the Corn Laws and certainly found them to be problematic. Ironically, the effort to repeal the Corn Laws was undertaken by a Tory prime minister named Robert Peel. And so you can always remember that. Robert Peel repealed the Corn Laws. And Robert Peel was a conservative. He was a Tory prime minister. He had a long public career, distinguished career in politics in Great Britain. He introduced the first police force in London. That's why the British police are called bobbies, just in case you have ever wondered. And he really led the effort to repeal the Corn Laws. Now, as a conservative, he had actually been part of the effort to bring them about, but it's this catastrophe that was happening in Ireland that really led Robert Peel to take on the Corn Laws. And we have to remember, too, think back to Karl Marx and the Communist Manifesto we read, that he wrote that in England in 1846. There was serious discontent. England and the rest of Europe was on the verge of violence, and you could sense that. It was an incredibly tense time. And so Robert Peel undertook this great battle in which he needed the alliance of members of the Whig Party and even some radicals in the British government. And it was a months-long political fight that ended in 1846 in the repeal of the Corn Laws. And thus cheap bread, okay? The monument to Robert Peel, cheap bread, that little, what looks like blocks or stone pyramid there, that tower is made of bread. And the repeal of the Corn Laws had an immediate effect. It lowered the price of bread and of food. And while it was too little and too late to really save Ireland from catastrophe, it had a profound effect on working class discontent in England itself. It cooled that off for sure. It cooled that off for sure. And while there were still other elements of discontent and worker unhappiness, for the most part, the working classes in England were pacified by this and other reforms of the time period, but very, and most importantly, by the repeal of the Corn Laws, because it made food cheaper. Hungry people are angry people. People who are not hungry are a little bit more subdued. And so the repeal of the Corn Laws spared England violent revolution and uprising in 1846. And as we will see next week, in 1848, Europe kind of collectively went boom. There were violent uprisings all over Europe in almost every major city, but not in England and not in London.